This is Federalist 15, Part 4. There is nothing absurd or impracticable in the idea of a league or alliance between independent nations for certain defined purposes precisely stated in a treaty regulating all the details of time, place, circumstance, and quantity, leaving nothing to future discretion and depending for its execution on the good faith of the parties. Compacts of this kind exist among all civilized nations, subject to the usual vicissitudes of peace and war, of observance and non-observance, as the interests or passions of the contracting parties dictate. In the early part of the present century, there was an epidemical rage in Europe for this species of compacts, from which the politicians of the times fondly hoped for benefits which were never realized. With a view to establishing the equilibrium of power and the peace of that part of the world, all the resources of negotiations were exhausted, and triple and quadruple alliances were formed, but they were scarcely formed before they were broken, giving an instructive but afflicting lesson to mankind how little independence is to be placed on treaties which have no other sanction than the obligations of good faith, and which oppose general considerations of peace and justice to the impulse of any immediate interest or passion. Basically, what he's trying to say is that the confederation that we have right now, that we live under, it's almost like the countries that make treaties between them. Once there's peace, they might respect it, but if they feel like their interests are not being met, they just drop it. They don't pay any attention to it. And he says, if we stay under a weak confederation like the one we have, we will be doing the same thing too. Becoming vulnerable, that in the short term, if not in the short term, in the long term, there will be animosity between us, and we will not respect their treaties and the peace compacts between us, and we will sooner or later get into war. He says, look at what happened in Europe. There were so many treaties at the beginning of the 18th century, but they were all violated in one time or another. If the particular states in this country are disposed to stand in a similar situation to each other, and to drop the project of a general discretionary superintendence, the scheme would indeed be pernicious and would entail upon us all the mischiefs which have been enumerated under the first head. But it would have the merit of being, at least, consistent and practicable. Abandoning all views towards a confederate government, this would bring us to a simple alliance, offensive and defensive, and would place us in a situation to be alternate friends and enemies of each other, as our mutual jealousies and rivalships, nourished by the intrigues of foreign nations, should prescribe to us. Like I said, he says sooner or later, if we only stay in these confederacies, in this confederacy, we will be vulnerable to become rivals and not friends. And then also at the same time, foreign nations will take advantage of our weak union and will get us to distrust one another, and our situation will be definitely awful. But if we are unwilling to be placed in this perilous situation, if we still will adhere to the design of a national government, or which is the same thing of a superintending power under the direction of a common council, we must resolve to incorporate into our plan those ingredients which may be considered as forming the characteristic difference between a league and a government. We must extend the authority of the Union to the persons of the citizens, the only proper objects of government. Remember, earlier in this Federalist, he said the most important thing is for the federal law to be applicable to the citizens. This way you don't have to ask the states for everything to be done, for them to apply the federal law on the citizens. Because it says this is not a good government. So we have to be under a government that when the national government, the federal government passes a law, citizens of different states respect and follow it, or be ready to be punished by that law. If this doesn't happen, then the government is just a joke. You cannot call it a government. And the reason he says this is because one of the main reasons is during the Revolutionary War, every time the Confederate government wanted something, it had to make a requisition to the states. It could not tax the citizens of those states directly. It had to ask the states, please send us so much money so that we can buy ammunition and different things that we need to run this war. And he says, in this new constitution, we have made it such that we can write laws that will apply to the citizens directly. And we don't need to go through the state governments to make requests from the people. And this makes this new constitution much better.